Hello and welcome to another episode of LA Rams Central. I'm currently right now in the works and trying to get a former Ram to call in and participate in some questions about the upcoming season and his thoughts on the Rams' move to LA. I don't want to say who it is yet because I'm still in the works of getting that done, but there is a possibility that could happen. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. Today's episode, really simple. It's going to be 15 minutes of Ram current events, 15 minutes of fandom, and 15 minutes of covering the Minnesota Vikings today. Today will be a Viking session. Next week, we will be covering the New Orleans Saints and a little bit of background on that. So first, as far as Ram current news, there's a couple things that I'm a little concerned about. First of all, season tickets, if you haven't heard, they are, the last I saw, and this was 2 weeks ago, they were up to 64,000 tickets sold. So keep it up, guys. People are gobbling up those season tickets. People are very excited about football in LA. In a stadium that fits 92, I think it's 92,000 in the LA Coliseum. They're at 64, and I'm sure that number is probably closer to the 70s now. It may even be 74. To be sold out, to be considered sold out, and keep in mind we are only in February, and that's a pretty big commitment that people have to make. To be sold out, I think the LA Coliseum needs to be between 77 and 78,000. So if they're not there already, they're probably pretty gosh darn close. Now it's a matter of reaching capacity. Couple things that were said this week that I'm a little concerned about. One is Mr. Snead's comments that the Rams may not necessarily need a quarterback. They don't necessarily have to go through the draft to get their quarterback. I'm looking at what's out there. Brock Osweiler is going to probably sign with Denver. Then again, I heard today that Brock Osweiler and that situation may not be as much of a slam dunk as a lot of us thought. There's no doubt Kirk Cousins is going to stay in Washington, but there is some doubt on Brock Osweiler. So I will say this. The Rams' decision to go get a quarterback in the draft is going to depend, as I said before, entirely upon how they're going to address free agency. If the Rams are sitting back saying, we're going to wait and see what the Broncos do with Brock Osweiler, we freed up all this money from the cap because we're specifically going to target one of those free agent potential quarterbacks, a Kirk Cousins, a Brock Osweiler. They're not going to need to spend a lot of money on RG3, so I don't think that's where their focus is if it's at the quarterback position. I do think the RG3 thing would be intriguing because with Gurley, you have to respect his running ability, and I think RG3 is a serviceable quarterback. And I think if you put him in a competition that's a legitimate competition with a guy like Nick Foles, I think that situation could really evolve into a win-win for the Rams organization. And again, I'm not ready to give up on Nick just yet, and I think that this season was a what you call a man check. We all go through this as men, and I don't care if you're men of faith or not. You have a moment where God, if you will, or some higher being, puts you in a situation where you have to really soul search and dig deep and go, okay, I needed this beat down. I've listened. I've learned. Now I'm going to demonstrate that knowledge. Now, me, I'm a man of faith, so for me, it's a matter of going, okay, God, I got it, and moving forward. And I think this could potentially be a very good thing for RG3 and what happened to him in Washington last year. And I will certainly say I felt like he handled it the way you'd hope a future leader or a future great quarterback would handle it. So we'll have to wait and see. But Snead's comments for me is less concerning and more uplifting because he said one of the mistakes that he made last year was giving Nick Foles the job before he earned it. I'm all for putting Nick Foles through the trials again and say, look, you lost this position. It's not guaranteed to you. I don't care that we traded for you. Earn it. Because I think Nick can earn it. I don't think the competition's stiff enough that he can't earn it. And if he earns it, I think there's going to be a little bit more of an onus on keeping it. And if he earns it and he's not having to look over his shoulder every 5 minutes, I think that's going to go a long way too. He's going to know, okay, you know what? I made a mistake, but these guys trust me because I earned the starting position. The worst thing that can happen for Nick is he earns the starting position through preseason, gets off to a 2-3-0 start, and maybe they struggle to a 2-3 finish down the let's say a 2-3 finish down the home stretch of the first half of the season. He's sitting at 5-3, and all of a sudden the Rams make a quarterback change. That would be the worst thing ever, and I don't think Fisher would be dumb enough to do that. But we'll have to wait and see. So the quarterback situation for me is intriguing because it sounds like the Rams are looking at all their options, and I think their options are really simple. I don't get the feeling they're going to move appreciatively too far up in the draft. I think the Rams are kind of looking at it going, we may move up 2 or 3 spots if we need to, but I don't think they're going to be moving up 5 or 10 spots. So I think they're looking at this situation going, okay, scenario A, and I genuinely believe this. Scenario A, let's go get somebody in free agency. If a Brock Osweiler pops up, let's go get him. If an RG3 pops up and we can get him for dirt cheap, let's bring him into LA. And that would just really screw the Redskins over because we got all of those players from the Redskins via the draft to then turn around and get the guy that they traded for anyway after he's had his ups and downs. And now it's a matter of turning him from from this potential player to a phenomenal player would be pretty amazing. And it would either be a failed experiment or not, but it would be a cheap one. So I think that's an option. They may turn around and say, okay, you know what? There wasn't anybody that great in free agency. We picked up, say, somebody like an RG3 who we think is good enough to start that may be able to compete for the position. But now we're going to really go after the draft hard, and we're going to either try to get Paxton Lynch, Carson Wentz, Goff from California, I forget who the other one is that everyone's been talking about. But those 3 certainly the Rams could be keeping their eye on. And if they fall to us, great, we've got the quarterback for the future and we can move forward. But I think the Rams are kind of expecting what I'm expecting, which is I don't think any one of those 3 are going to be there by the time the Rams pick. Unless they move up to a 12 spot, then I think it could be there. But I think it's going to be a Paxton Lynch. I don't think it's going to be either one of the other 2. And that then poses a problem because now you're like, okay, we didn't get, let's say scenario 3, because we said scenario A is they get a big-name quarterback in free agency, they're solid. Scenario B is this scenario, rather. So scenario B, which is this scenario, is they get one of those quarterbacks with the 12th or 13th pick, depending on how high up they move, because I don't think they're going to be able to move up 5 whole spots. And still, I don't think they're willing to do that. I think they might move up a couple, but that's about as far as they're going to move. So that's scenario B. Scenario C is the worst-case scenario where they go, well, we didn't get a quarterback. And we got a serviceable guy like an RG3 or a backup that's going to compete with Nick and push him along with Case Keenum. And we're going to take our chances getting skill position players and building up on the offensive side of the ball around him to make him better. I don't know what scenario they're going to actually do. I can tell you, as much as I like Brock Osweiler, as much as I like RG3, I would rather see the Rams sell out to get their quarterback in the draft. And what I mean by that is you give up a second and a third round this year and a 5th round next year, or a second and a third this year and a third next year, and get your 1st round pick, which I know that sounds steep, guys. I'm not saying 2nd and 3rd this year. Let me start over. That's not what I meant. You give up your 1st this year and a 2nd and 3rd next year with a 3rd round this year. So you give a 1st and a 3rd, okay, 1st and a 3rd, and you give up a 2nd and a 3rd next year. That's a steep price to pay to move up. But I don't think either one of these 3 quarterbacks is going to be a bad option for the Rams in the end. So if you genuinely believe, and I do, that these guys are the real deal, then you got to sell out. And you got to sit there and go, we still have our 2nd this year, so we'll make sure we get him somebody to throw to. And we're going to really do our homework and our diligence on on picks 4, 5, and 6, and 7. And then next year, we still have our 1, so we got to make sure that we get the right guy with the number 1 spot. So yeah, I don't think it's a bad idea to make that kind of move to get the guy you need to get. And I hope the Rams understand the basic principles of that. There are a couple of things that I think are intriguing. Peyton Manning still hasn't retired. There's still idiots bantering around, hey, maybe the Rams can get Peyton Manning. I would rather play with a one-armed Nick Foles, a one-legged Nick Foles, than a Peyton Manning. I've made my opinions clear on the matter. You're not going to be productive with Peyton Manning under center, especially now. So it's better to look to the future and get this thing right. So when you christen the new stadium, you're entering in with a new quarterback, potentially, if not sooner. I think the Rams of LA need that. The fans of LA need that. The Rams of LA. I think the Rams of LA do need that too. But certainly the fans, to build enthusiasm, need to do that. Now, I've had a couple of interesting things in comments over the last week. I had an interesting back and forth with a gentleman who thinks that the Rams are going to spend a lot of their cap money on their own free agents. There's no doubt that the Rams are talking about signing Gaines, Jenkins, and Trumaine Johnson. I can't say enough how disappointed I am if they do that. I don't think last year, when I look at their team, and I sit there and I say, I see that we got torched by the San Francisco 49ers, the Chicago Bears, without Alshon Jeffries, by the way. It was a tight end that killed us. A tight end. We got burned by a lot of bad football teams down the stretch. We can't afford that anymore. We've got to lock down the secondary, and we need to spend that money on free agency in the secondary to make it better. And I don't believe spending that money on the free agent on our free agents to be corners is a smart move. But I do think the Rams are going to do it. I think you're going to see all of the secondary back in place, and maybe with another year of training they'll be better, but they haven't been impressive, and I don't think it's the right move. But I still think it'll have enough money, the team will still have enough money to really target a big-name free agent. Maybe a quarterback, maybe a wide receiver. Although Pierre Garçon, just for you guys, you know I've been talking about him, it looks like the Redskins are going to sign him. So Pierre Garçon's off the market. So now we got to find another receiver that's a good big target who's got talent that might come cheap. Or then again, maybe that's what the Rams freed up all that cap money for, to zero in on one of those big-name wide receivers and try to spend some money and bring that side of the ball in so they have some options. I wouldn't be surprised if they spent that money at the lineman position too in free agency. As I said, go get an Okun, go get a Mack. Those are all options that the Rams could look at. So who really knows where that money's going to go? But I do know a portion of it is definitely going to go to their secondary, which I think is their greatest disappointment. Outside of T.J. McDonald and Joyner, I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of any of them. Trumaine Johnson is a serviceable nickelback at best. Gaines is an okay corner that I don't like his length. I don't like his coverage ability, and I certainly don't like his hitting ability. And then you've got a guy like Janoris Jenkins who can pick six anybody, but he can also get burned for a 50-yard touchdown against the most pathetic receiver in the league, while the next week he can potentially shut down for 3 quarters the best receiver in the league, only to get burned for the game-winning touchdown like we saw a couple of times last year. You know, how do you get burned by Baltimore's wide receivers for a 50-yard gain on 13? And it was like a 30-yard completion. It cost us the football game. He is too inconsistent, and I think he would make a nice number 2, maybe even a nickel, and you could bump Trumaine to a dime. I don't think Gaines is worth a nickel or a dime, pun intended. But, you know, again, they're young, so who knows? Maybe with another year of training, they'll go from there. So, other than the quarterback position, guys, don't be surprised if the Rams do make a play on a wide receiver, because we talked about Tavon Austin not being an option or a very weak option at wide receiver. We need to get ourselves a better wide receiver now. And if they're not going to address it in free agency, that could be a position they look at. Maybe they're looking at linebacker, although I think the offense is going to get the first-round pick. I think they're going to focus on that side of the ball. And again, I think wide receiver's an option. I think line's an option if it's there. But I definitely think the Rams really want that to be the quarterback position if they can help it. So that's it for Ram Current News. 64,000 fans so far as of 3 weeks ago have gotten tickets, and things are looking great. So keep up the good work, guys, and we will head to segment 2 next, which is where we are going to do a little bit of talking about the Minnesota Vikings. So stay tuned. All right, for this next segment, we're going to talk a little bit about the Minnesota Vikings. Now, I want to give you a little bit of backstory on Minnesota. First and foremost, as a Rams fan, they have been the bane of our existence. And this goes back to 1969. So, for those of you that are Ram fans, be ready to cringe. For those of you that are Viking fans, get ready to gloat. 69, we couldn't crack the Viking code. We lost both in the regular season and in the postseason to them. In 1974, we lost to them in the NFC Championship game. In 1976, we lost to them in the NFC Championship game. 1977, we lost to them in the Mud Bowl, 14-7. And it wasn't until 1978 that the Rams really figured out the Vikings. And I know a lot of Viking fans are going to say, well, Fran didn't play that game. They were old. They were this. They were that. Well, I remind you, the Rams were old too. The Rams were a relatively older team as well by 78. They just aged, I think, a little more appropriately than the Vikings had. And there's no question that Bob Lee played a great game the year before, and Fran Tarkenton was actually in that game in 78. Played his last game against the Rams and lost in the divisional round, and the next year Roger Staubach would suffer the same fate. The Rams wouldn't meet the Vikings again after the 78 season until 10 years later in 1988. They went into Minnesota and lost in the Dome, and essentially that was it. They were 1-5 against the Vikings all-time postseason. 99, the Rams were in St. Louis, played the Vikings in St. Louis, and crushed them. 49-37, and the game wasn't even really that close. So that kind of put us over the top. So the Rams and Vikings have quite the history, and I'm kind of excited to see the LA Rams against the Minnesota Vikings again. I will say I'm disappointed that Minnesota's going back into the Dome. I think you saw the clear advantage of playing outdoors had for them in the postseason against a team like Seattle. Even though they lost that game, and I know hearts were broken everywhere when Blair missed the field goal. But give that kid some credit. He had a great year for you, and don't give up on the kid because of one bad kick. One bad kick does not make a choke artist. I remind people that Adam Vinatieri in 2000 was not the best kicker. He lost 3 games at the end where a field goal would have won it for him in 2000. And he still fared well for him. And he was their kicker in 1996 when they were the New England Patriots in the Super Bowl against the then Green Bay Packers. Super Bowl 31. Not that then. It's not like Green Bay's moved, but that's who they played in Super Bowl 31. And got beat. And Adam Vinatieri, although he didn't miss any kicks in that game, he did miss quite a few what would have been game-winning kicks from 99 through 2000, and it wasn't really until 2001 he had his coming out party. So the moral of the story is don't give up on Blair. The Vikings' problems are very unique. Minnesota is one of those teams that made the playoffs last year that nobody's afraid of. There isn't anybody on their schedule that looks and sees the Minnesota Vikings right now that doesn't think we could beat this football team. Now, teams thought that last year, and they were sorely mistaken. After Minnesota's shaky 2-2 start, the Vikings ended up winning 6 of their next 8 games before finishing the season 3-0. So they after the 2-2 stretch, they had a 6-2 stretch before finishing 3-0. So, and some of those numbers overlap. When you look at their schedule, you'll know what I'm talking about. But the bottom line is they were a good football team for a good long time. And a lot of people thought they were going to beat them. And especially that mid part of the season when nobody could beat the Vikings. I mean, you're talking about a 3-point loss to the Denver Broncos and a inexplicably bad loss to the Seattle Seahawks. There was a stretch there where they were pretty dominant and pretty good. So I think the talent is there for the Vikings to do well next year. But there's no question that their talent is all on the offensive side of the ball. Stephon Diggs at wide receiver, who I don't think is that great of a wide receiver. 1 year does not make a Hall of Fame career, and he didn't even really put up numbers that would make you think he has that potential anyway. He put up good numbers, and many people may blame Teddy Bridgewater. Teddy Bridgewater reminds me a lot of the Ram quarterbacks from 84 to midway through 86. And I say midway because in '86 they finally gave the starting job to Jim Everett, whose first pass ever as a Ram was a touchdown pass to Henry Ellard against the New England Patriots. In a game the Rams lost at Anaheim on a Hail Mary at the end of the game, 30-28. Irving Fryer fumbled 2 punts in that game and then ended up catching the Hail Mary for the game-winning touchdown inexplicably. And it was only a 30-yard Hail Mary. It's not like it was from midfield, and it was a complete catastrophe. But nonetheless, New England did win. So Teddy Bridgewater does, though. He reminds me a lot of like a Jeff Kemp, Dieter Brock, Bartowski type. Can he win you a game by himself? No. So what does that mean? What that means is he needs to have players around him. Now, Teddy Bridgewater is a nice player, but Adrian Peterson's the real deal. And when you look at them, you go, okay, well, then what do they need to do? What do they need to address? I really think they need to address the defense side of the ball because despite all of their success, you have to give it credit where credit's due, and credit needs to go to Zimmerman. And you may not like Zimmerman like me. You may feel he's a crybaby, because he is, whining that Teddy Bridgewater was cheap-shotted, and, oh, he's got a concussion, and, oh, we're going to lose him for all these games. Yeah, Teddy Bridgewater back the next week. It was all a bunch of theater and theatrics. It was almost like watching a soccer game when a guy runs by another guy and the guy drops down in a heap of meat, grabbing his knee like his leg had imploded from the contact or some. It was too much theatrics. You were fine. Get up and play. And he didn't. They got that 15-yard penalty, or at least they fought for it, and I believe they did get it. But once again, the Rams lose to Minnesota. So, tough pill to swallow. But when you look at their defensive numbers, it's a little alarming. They had 2 bad losses last year to the Tennessee Titans, 24-17 in Tennessee, and 20-3 to the 49ers in San Francisco. They were 60th in the league in points per game, so offensively they're middle of the road, so they definitely could use some help there. But 29th in the league in yards per game. Defensively, yards per game. They were 31st against the pass and 31st against the rush. They've got to improve their defense. And in a draft that is all about the defense, I would be shocked if Minnesota went any other direction other than defense. Where are they going to go on defense? Linebacker's a possibility. D-line's a possibility. I would even say don't rule out the secondary, although I think the secondary played well. It was the front 7 for them that really kind of imploded and prevented them from getting things done that they need to get done. So I look for the Vikings to maybe look there. Minnesota's one of those teams, guys. I don't think Minnesota's good enough to make the playoffs next year. I didn't think they were good enough this year, and I give credit where credit's due. I think Zimmerman's a good enough coach to get 8 or 9 wins out of them, but I think both wildcard teams are going to come out of the NFC West next year, and I just don't think 9 wins is going to be enough for the Minnesota Vikings. And in the end, we don't know because you got to play the games and see what they do in free agency and the draft or what trades they make. But the Vikings have too many holes. And in today's football, when you can be 31st against the pass and rush and still win a division like the Vikings did against the Green Bay Packers, that's deplorable. And it's not something – let's put it this way. That is not going to give you continued success. You might get away with that in 1 year, but you're not going to get away with that in another year. And I think people kind of know, okay, we know what the Vikings are about. Adrian Peterson was fresh. He came off a year where he was determined to do well. He's a great running back. I don't think people, though, learn to fear Teddy Bridgewater. I don't think people learn to fear Stephon Diggs. I don't think people learn to fear the Viking defense or the game plan that Mike Zimmerman, I keep calling him Mike Zimmerman. I think that's his name. Zimmerman, anyway, is their coach. Put forward. I don't think so. Now, I'm not trashing Zimmer. I think he's a great coach. He's a good coach. Anybody that can take that team and turn into a playoff team, I think deserves a lot of credit. And like Bruce Arians, when you have a good coach, man, you can do a lot of damage down the stretch. But in the end, you need more than just that. So I don't know what the Vikings are looking at doing in free agency. I know what they should do. They definitely should be looking at defense. And maybe they're going to go get a linebacker like a James Laurinaitis. Maybe they're going to go get a pass rusher. I think what they really should do, though, is focus on linebacker and potentially even potentially even wide receiver in the free agent market, and then turn their attention to the D-line, linebacker, or secondary for the draft. But the Vikings had a good year. You got to give them credit. They're division champs. They lost a heartbreaker to Seattle in a game they should have won. But then they ruin all that. Like, they're going to be in a dome next year. I don't get it. Why? Why? You're Minnesota. You belong outdoors. You saw how ineffective you made the Seahawks look. In comparison to how they looked against Carolina, who had an infinitely better defense than you did, the weather was an asset. And these teams up north, I don't understand. That's why Green Bay, to me, is the smartest team in football. Green Bay and the Bears. Like, the Lions, the Vikings, they're dumb. They're dumb. They go into these domes. I don't get it. So, on behalf of the LA Rams, thank you, because if we ever play you in the postseason and we got to play in a dome, I think we have much better chance of beating you there than we did outdoors, as we showed in the 70s. But then again, in the 80s, we lost in the dome too. 28-17 to the Vikings in the Metrodome. So who knows? But I definitely think that this is it's a good time for Minnesota, because I do think the Vikings are improving. I think they're getting better. I think they're way ahead of schedule. I think they're going to come back down to the reality that they're not a playoff team yet. But I think they've got the right coach. I think their back is hitting the right stride of his career. I think the quarterback has potential. They got a good young wide receiver. Now they've got to build around it. And I think in 3 years or so, Minnesota could be a pretty dominant football team. And that would be fitting, because the Rams and Vikings would be going at it once again, just like they did from 1969 to 1978, until they had that 10-year hiatus where they met again in 1988. So time will tell. But again, it's a good young football team that's going to get better. And if you're a Viking fan, you have reason for optimism and excitement. And who knows? They proved me wrong this year. Maybe they'll prove me wrong next year and make the playoffs. So they definitely have that potential. All right, so next we're going to do a bit of fandom. So one of the things that I want to do today for this week's segment of fandom is I wanted to talk a little bit about the Rams as a whole, not just coming back to LA, but because we've talked about that to the point of ad nauseum. So I want to talk about where the Rams are right now, looking at their cuts and looking at their football team, why, they made those moves, which we talked about last week, but what that means, in my opinion, now, and to tell you a little bit about me as a Ram fan. So, as we know, the Rams made a couple of very intriguing cuts. And, it hurts to lose a guy like Laurinaitis and Chris Long, but it does help in the sense that we have talent still. And when you look at our front four, I think this opens an opportunity for Brockers. I'd like to see the Rams do something here. This may sound crazy. In fact, I know it probably does. But I'd like to see the Rams move Nick Fairley to defensive end. I don't want Sims there. Sims is a good secondary defensive end. I'd like to move Fairley from tackle to end. Provide a bull rush and a speed rush, and let Brockers play once again in the interior. Brockers at one point was a very high thought of player, and he had a good year his rookie year, not as good as Aaron Donald clearly. But with Aaron Donald at the other D tackle spot, I think he can play a role very similar to a Mike Matuzak of the Oakland Raiders back in the 70s and 80s. I think he can be a guy that can be a disruptive force against the run, who can be a nuisance to the quarterback, because so much attention is given to other players on the defensive line. And that other players specifically being Quinn and Donald. Fairley would have a fairly good chance, pun intended, of fine-tuning his game with a lot of one-on-one coverage, and you can see if he's cut out to be there or not. And maybe Eugene Sims beats him out for that other defensive end spot, but I'd like to see Brockers get back in the rotation somehow. Now that Long's gone, I think you can make some adjustments there and make some fixes that I think the Rams really desperately need to do. And it's one of those things you just don't know if it's going to work. But it's something that I would like to see happen. I would also like to see the Rams, if they do not go get a quarterback in the free agent market, and they decide to go with one of these rookies and they really make a play to get one and they get one. I do agree with Snead. I think they need to have a competition. But I think they need to be legitimately okay with Foles getting the starting position if he gets it. And if he gets it, he needs to keep it. It can't be one of these replace him midway through things because it's not good for him. And it's certainly not going to help the Rams improve their record, and it's certainly not going to help the guys around him having faith in him. Nick won a couple of big games for us, and I think he's a good idea to groom or a good potential player to groom somebody along the way. But he's young enough where he wants to be a starter. And if you can get him exposure and if he can get the job done and be a playoff caliber quarterback while you're grooming your young stud, then he becomes a tradable commodity where you can maybe get back some of those picks you traded to move up to get said quarterback in your system. So it'll be interesting to see what the Rams do there as opposed to what they should do. Do they actually follow through and do it? The other thing that I need to see the Rams do is they need to get rid of Chris Weinke as their quarterback's coach. Is that really the best you could do? Honestly, no wonder Foles struggled. No wonder the quarterback position's been in shambles. The guy is forever going to be known as the quarterback to go 1-0 and then lose 15 straight games. He is awful. And I don't get taking somebody who was not a good quarterback in the pros. Not even good. Like, I would have taken him if he was serviceable. Like, I get Bartowski being a quarterback's coach for a period of time. He was at least a decent quarterback. He wasn't good. He wasn't great, but he was decent. Weinke wasn't even decent. He was so awful that nobody picked him up. Like, he was awful. He had the 1 year, and then they were like, never again, under any circumstance. And we pick him up as our quarterback's coach. I don't get the logic, and I don't get the benefit. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is the Rams need to go find somebody that can get the job done. And there are plenty of quarterback coaches out there in the college ranks, in the pro ranks that have done it better and have done it longer. So I'd like to see the Rams do that. So a lot of people have asked me, Anthony, why the Rams? It doesn't make sense to me. Why the Rams? Especially when they find out I was born in Maine, which is New England Patriot country. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why the LA Rams for me. And I think this is a good moment to do this. I touched on this a little bit in the first show, but I'm really going to go into detail here. So for me, it's simple. It starts as a young man in 1983 watching football with my dad. And me and my dad used to watch a lot of the Patriot games. And it just so happened this particular season, 1983, the Patriots traveled to Anaheim, and we got the game on TV. And it was my first exposure to Eric Dickerson, and I remember seeing the cool face mask and the goggles and all of the equipment, and he just looked so, awesome. I was like, oh, I love this guy. He looks cool. And I remember just being enthralled. Every time he ran, I was glued. And the Rams ended up losing the game 21-7. Dickerson didn't even score a touchdown in that game. But I remember telling my dad, I like that team. That's my team. And I think my dad thought I was talking about the New England Patriots. But I was talking about the Rams. And I said, no, the team with the horns on their helmet. And my dad was like, the Rams? Why the Rams? And I said, well, I like their running back. I didn't know it was a running back. I said, I like number 29. I think he's cool. I like the uniforms. I think they're cool. I remember saying, too, I like number 85. That dude looks really cool. He's all jacked up, which, of course, was Jack Youngblood. And then, of course, I told my dad I like the quarterback. I like number 15, too. So, and my dad was like, well, who did you like on the other team? And I said, no one. I grew up in New England. I mean, I like Grogan. And I did say I like Grogan, but he's not as cool as number 15. And my dad was like, well, that's Vince Ferragamo. He's okay in my book. He's an Italian, blah, blah, blah. And it was just, it was a very special time in my life because as I started watching, all of my favorite players were on this team. And I got more and more invested and more invested. And then in November of 85, we moved to Maine. To Arizona. And I got a lot of their games on TV in the rest of the 85 season and through 86 and into 87. And by 88, I was recording games. And by 89, I was glued to the TV. And then I became an 11-year-old disinterested kid by 91 or by 90. And, I followed them and I still watched, but it wasn't as consistent. And it had nothing to do with their winning and losing. In fact, my interest correlated directly with their losing. When I stopped being as interested is when they started to lose games. So naturally, as a young man, I blame myself for that. But then as I started watching and they just weren't as good, and I got more of a reality on how football and sports works. No one player has an individual impact that much, or one player, one person. But I certainly grew an interest. And then in 94, when the team moved to St. Louis, part of me was devastated, but I said, you know what, I'm going to follow my team. I don't know what any of this means. I'm too young to understand it. I followed them. And then, of course, I stayed a Rams fan, through that time and the greatest show on turf. And everything was great until everything wasn't great. And then I still followed them. And then here we are. I'm hosting a show called LA Rams Central with my boys back home where they belong. And I'm going to be going to games. And I'm really, really excited. The first NFL game I ever saw was the LA Rams at the Phoenix Cardinals in the early 90s. The Rams got crushed. Neat story. I'm the only one sitting there in a sea of blue or sea of red. I'm the only blue shirt anywhere. And you could tell, I saw on the Jumbotron, you could see where I was sitting. It was the funniest thing. And it was during a commercial timeout. Flipper Anderson was the Rams wide receiver. He kept burning the Cardinals on a post. Every time he ran the post, the safety bit up to cover and stop Jerome Bettis, who was a rookie. This was 93. And he came wide open on the post. And I finally was fed up with it. And I'm like, it was during a commercial timeout, and the players were on the field, and Flipper was on our side. And I yelled as loud as I could, and it was quiet. There was no music being played. There was nothing. And I yelled, Flipper! Flipper! As loud as I could. And he looked up to where I was sitting. And I know he saw me because I'm the only blue shirt. And I said, will you tell him to throw you on a post? You're open every time. And he gives me a thumbs up, which I thought was the coolest thing, like he had heard me. Right out of the timeout, that's exactly what they had called, Flipper on a post. Everett hit him in stride. Touchdown Rams. 38-3 becomes 38-10. We still got annihilated, but I called the touchdown. And I wish I could tell you that story was just where the story ends, and you guys could be like, oh, what a homer. He thinks Flipper hurt him, and he thinks that he was giving the thumbs. It's a lame story. Here's where I have the proof in the pudding. At the end of the game, we go down to where the Rams are signing autographs. And I find Flipper Anderson, and I say, Flipper, can you sign this? Remember, I'm like a 12-year-old, 13-year-old kid, a 14-year-old kid. And Flipper goes, you're the kid. I said, Flipper, can you sign this? And I was like, sure. And I'm like, I'm glad they finally hit you on the post. And he's like, are you the kid that said that? And I was like, yeah, I was the one that said that in the stands. He's like, dude, I'm going to get everyone to sign this. He takes my program. He goes into the bus and gets everybody, Jerome Bettis, Jackie Slater, everyone in the bus. I think Tony Zendejas. He got Jim Everett. Everyone to sign the planner. It was the coolest thing ever. And he came back and he's like, nice call, kid. Nice call. And kind of gave me a high five and got on the bus and went. And it was the coolest experience of my life because I loved Flipper in the 80s and the 90s. I grew up. I was devastated when he went to the Colts. Flipper was my guy. So it was a pretty neat experience. And when that happens, you're pretty much solidified a fan for life. It doesn't matter what happens. So that's my reasoning and my travels. and that is why I'm a Rams fan. So now you know my story, and you know why now I will travel with them no matter where they go, although I can happily say they will never leave LA again. A, because I don't think the league will allow it, and B, because I don't think it'll be financially fruitful for the Rams to do so. So go LA Rams, and until next week, I hope you enjoyed LA Rams Central. Any comments or questions, please answer down or ask them down on the comment section in the bottom, and we will cover the New Orleans Saints next week. This is Anthony Manor from LA Rams Central. Have a good night.